We're back. This is Eastern Carolina News and Views with Tom and Sadie on 103.7 WTIB and 94.1 WNBU.
Well, we've been talking about it for the last few days, and with us right now, the former Speaker of the House and presidential candidate, Newt Gingrich. Newt, welcome to News and Views.
Well, listen, it's great to be with you, and I hope you're having a great day.
We
Thanks, you too.
Welcome in to Eastern North Carolina. Mr. Speaker, we interestingly just had Tom Price on the program, who now, of course, represents your old district, Congressional District 6 in Georgia. I must say, you were our sharp cookie, but Tom Price is a pretty sharp cookie as well. They've got some good representation.
He's a medical doctor. He's a very smart guy. He works very hard. I think he's going to be the next budget chairman, and he really does have the intelligence and the drive to help us get back to a balanced budget. So I'm very proud of the job he's done representing us, and you were very fortunate to have a guy of that caliber on your show.
Well, we had him, and he was visiting the Heart Center down here, and it was a fun visit. Let me ask you, he has written a counter to the Affordable Care Act, the Empowering Patients First Act. Have you had a chance to look at that? What do you think?
I think he moves us in the right direction. He understands that both as a medical doctor and as a conservative that we want to move people back to be in charge of their own health. We do not want Washington bureaucrats making those kind of decisions. And I think that he really gets it and he understands exactly what we have to be doing. So that's a very important step. It is so much better than the so-called Affordable Care Act, which is rapidly becoming the Unaffordable Care Act, that I really think that he's on to something.
There is another regulation. I don't want to call it legislation because I don't think it is. It's coming out of the Department of Education. I know you've written on it, and you've got some concerns over it. It's called the Gainful Employment Regulation. And basically, it's going to pull the reins in on student loans from the federal government. We've read your article and done a little bit more investigating on it. You know, I think there's some common sense things attached to it, but you have some concerns over this. Give us a little explanation of what this regulation would entail and what your concerns are.
Well, let me say, first of all, anybody who really wants to understand this in detail, you can go to opportunitydenied.org. And you'll see how bad this is. This is Washington bureaucrats under Barack Obama writing an 842-page regulation, which is really just the very fact that it's 842 pages tells you it ain't good. It is basically designed to be anti-small business, anti-free enterprise, anti-for-profit, does not apply to any government-run school, and says here's a double standard. And they then set up a bunch of record-keeping requirements that are so difficult that they virtually guarantee that thousands of people, in fact, we estimate hundreds of thousands of people, will be denied the chance to go to school because it'll just be too expensive to keep the records. What really makes this so tragic is that the people this really hurts are the working mothers, Latinos, African Americans, people who are in a position where they have to work. They can't leave full time just to go to school, but they want to do better. They want to have a better future. They want to get a better job. And what this does is it cuts them off because those are folks who need to be able to go to work. You know, they need to go to school in the evening. They need to go to school on the weekends. And the Washington bureaucrats seem to have no sympathy for the challenges you face if you're working. You don't have a very good education. You want to get ahead, and you need a chance to go out and learn and improve yourself and get a better job. And that's why if you do get a chance to go to opportunitydenied.org, you'll see that this is really a very destructive proposal.
One of the things that, as I read your article, I sort of connected the dots, and I'm assuming that one of the things you said that it does is it would regulate the percentage of students who could default on their student loans.
No, it's not even about defaulting on your student loans. What is really crippling here is it says that you have to make an income that's above a certain number based on how much you have borrowed to go to school. And in order for the school to prove that, they're going to have access to your income tax forms for 5 or 10 years after you leave school.
Right.
Now, imagine, first of all, the paperwork, but also imagine the intrusion into your personal life. And how many folks do you know who want to send their school their income tax return?
Well, they're not going to do it.
That's right. This is really set up, and if they don't do it, then the school gets punished, even though it was the student who didn't do it. So this is really a setup designed to hurt small businesses and free enterprise-oriented schools, primarily because the Washington bureaucrats are against businesses, they're against making a profit, they're against the kind of free enterprise that has made America great, and they have a tremendous bias in favor of government-run bureaucratic schools.
Well, the critics are saying that it's like the subprime mortgage, the housing bubble, the kind of the next thing where we're just giving out loans to people who a lot of these students are getting out of college and not able to get jobs, so then they default on their loans, and so they're saying that this is the next big bubble, and they're trying to prevent it by these regulations. Would you agree with any of that?
Well, look, I think if the regulation were written to apply to both government schools and private sector schools, I would have some sympathy, because there are clearly, if you have a really bad school, whether it's run by the government or it's run by a private business, if it has 40-50% of its students defaulting, they're not getting educated, they're not getting jobs, clearly that school is an act of fraud. But I think it's very telling that the Department of Education is not willing to apply the same standard to government-run schools. And in fact, they know if they tried to do it, that the uproar would be so enormous from the government-run schools that they couldn't possibly pull it off.
Our special guest this afternoon is former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. Mr. Speaker, is this just another example of this administration trying to legislate through regulation?
Well, I think that there's no question that when President Obama can't get anything through the Congress, he just gives the bureaucrats more and more and more control and tells them to go out and exercise their power unilaterally, and does things that I think are illegal and unconstitutional. I mean, we were founded by our founding fathers as a constitutional government in which the Congress has to pass certain laws. The president executes them. That's why it's called the executive branch. And what we're watching right now is, I think, is just very, very destructive.
Sadie thinks you are the smartest man alive, and I would probably second that. But how do you...
Listen, let me first of all just say thank you to her. Even if it's not true, my mother will be so grateful that you said it.
No, seriously, we have interviewed presidential candidates on down, and I have never had sweaty palms like I do today.
I don't mean to get your palms to sweat.
It's okay.
You are a historian. By the way, the first time I met you, I think was back in, I want to say it was either 79 or 80. You were a freshman. You spoke at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention at the Sheraton in Washington, D.C., and you were doing one of the workshops. It was a freshman historian in Congress, and I walked away from that time together, and I thought, this guy is impressive, and indeed, you've had quite a career. But as a historian and as someone who knows the Constitution well, what can Congress do to keep a president in check? I mean, it was Adams that said, the Constitution is for a good and religious people, and without it, it's hard to enforce it. And that's my paraphrase of his quote. But what can Congress do to keep this guy in check?
Well, the Founding Fathers gave Congress the power of the purse. And it's unequivocal. It's 100%. And I think that they should be finding 100 different ways to cut off his money, do it in ways that he can't close the government and then blame them, and just crowd him every single day with different requirements. And every time he needs something, make sure that he pays for it by further restricting him. I also think they should be much more dramatically holding hearings, looking at how bad things are. I mean, when you realize that the Internal Revenue Service last year sent $4 billion in checks to people who didn't deserve the refunds, including 343 checks to one house in Shanghai, China. You know that's government, that is bureaucracy so incompetent that it has to be investigated. I wrote a book on it called Breakout, in which I outlined just how big the gap is between bad government and what's happening to us with smartphones and iPads and all the things we have in our private lives. And the gap gets wider every year between the incompetence of the bureaucracy and the potential we have to dramatically modernize things.
It is quite frustrating. Let me change gears on you just a little bit. Now, I realize that if Newt Gingrich had won the primary and been the president, we probably wouldn't have the foreign policy scenario that we have today. Nonetheless, we are where we are. The cards that we're holding is what we have. If Newt Gingrich was suddenly swept into the White House tomorrow, how would you handle the current situation that we have, especially in the Middle East and ISIS?
Yeah, let me say to our listeners, first of all, that at GingrichProductions.com, I do a weekly podcast that is free and 2 weekly newsletters that are free. And I'm in the process in a series of newsletters of outlining the answer to your question.
Okay.
And I want to draw a distinction. I think in the case of Putin and the Ukraine, all of the Western world has an obligation to help the Ukrainians. We can do it without using American troops. We can do it with equipment. We can do it with training. We can do it with intelligence assets. But we want to make it extraordinarily expensive for the Russians to be as aggressive as they're currently being, because it's a dangerous habit to let them think they can get away with it. Second, in the case of the Islamic State, I think, and this is something I'm actually writing about both today in my newsletter, and I'm going to expand on it Friday, and I have a newsletter that's going to be called ISIS and Ebola. And the reason is the Islamic State needs to be seen not as a geographic state in Iraq and Syria, but as a virus exactly like Ebola. There are over 10,000 potential terrorists who are now in Syria and Iraq. They come from over 50 countries. We have well over 100 Americans in that group. We've had 2 people from Minnesota killed now, who have gone over to be terrorists. We've had over 500 people from Britain are now believed to be in that group. And this has to be seen as a problem in stopping a virus, not a problem in stopping a traditional state. And so I would start from that perspective, and I would recognize that Boko Haram in Nigeria and Hamas in Israel are exactly the same pattern as is Al-Qaeda and as is the Taliban and as is the people who are running ISIS. And that means you've got to have a totally different strategy. And in Britain, for example, Prime Minister Cameron is now taking away the passports of anybody who goes to fight for Syria. I mean, for the Islamic State. And he said, look, if you're going to side with a group of people who behead Westerners and who are trying to destroy our civilization, then you give up the right to be a British citizen. Now, that's very strong language and a very strong position, but that's the kind of fight we're going to find ourselves in.
The fact that Obama came out today and said we're going to destroy ISIS in Iraq.
It's just nonsense.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like the vice president today said something about we are
chase them down to the gates of hell.
Going to send them to the gates of hell, which, by the way, was exactly the same sentence he used in the vice presidential debate in 2012 about what happened in Libya. I mean, just at least you ought to get a new speechwriter.
What do you think is, and I don't want to put a wet blanket on our conversation here, but a little bit of concern about these missing airlines over in Libya. 9/11 is a week from tomorrow.
That's not a wet blanket.
Yeah.
We ought to be concerned. I don't understand it. I'm not sure it's true. But there certainly are reports that there may be up to a dozen civilian airliners that have been stolen by terrorists. The Algerians and the Tunisians and the Egyptians all believe it's true, and they will now not allow any airplane to fly out of Libya into their airspace because they think that there's a danger that they're going to be run by terrorists. So I think you have to take it seriously. There's no question. I mean, I've seen video, for example, of the Islamic State using drones that it builds itself. So we have to understand these are not backwards people who are hiding somewhere. These are people, many of whom are fairly well educated. Some of them are engineers. They've studied the modern world. They've studied our methods. And that's why I think this is a very serious crisis.
Any speculation as to why Obama, who has been apparently, according to the Pentagon, has been informed very well for the last year, comes out with no strategy? Well,
first of all, it is very hard if you're working and focusing on your golf game. I mean, you have to say to yourself, okay, which am I going to do next? I got an easy putt here, or I could be thinking about the Islamic State. Now, how can you ask a guy like Obama to think about something serious when he has a chance to go out with 3 of his friends, and relax and enjoy life. I mean, I almost think sometimes he's come to the conclusion that he's going to be a terrible president, so he might as well enjoy it.
That, or he's doing exactly what he wants to do. And I've thrown this thought out time and time again. I'm not so sure that his punting on doing anything about these Muslim jihadists is not by design.
Well, I think there's some truth to that. If you saw one of his comments in the last couple of days, he said, look, the world's always been messy. I mean, what a great position. This would be like a fireman saying, look, there have always been fires.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, why do you think our fire department's going to answer every single fire? You know, we kind of get tired of doing that.
Yeah, it's like he's throwing his hands up.
You'd like to have a president of the United States who was a serious person, but I also believe that Obama's model, because I think all of us underestimated, with the exception of Sean Hannity, who I give a lot of credit to, virtually all of us underestimated how really far to the left Obama is. And I think his worldview is one in which the weaker America is, the better the world is.
Oh, yeah.
And in which, you know, we shouldn't be pushy, we shouldn't be judgmental, we should always bend over backwards no matter what happens. And I think that he really desperately wants to minimize conflict. And he's in a world, frankly, where the tragedy is that the aggressive bad guys grow stronger the weaker the good guys are.
Do you think that we'll survive another 2 years of his presidency? And then after that,
it may be painful and it may be expensive, but look, this is a great country. We survived Pearl Harbor in the Second World War. We survived 46 years of competing with the Soviet Union. We survived a civil war. We survived 8 years of our War of Independence. You know, we just survived the Great Depression. Now, that doesn't mean it's fun or easy or desirable. And if you were to say to me, do I think we could do a lot better if we had somebody else as president? Of course, I believe that. But I think we'll survive him. And I think he may set the stage for one of the great debates in American history, because he is so bad that he is in many ways discrediting modern left-wing thinking and giving us a chance to really have a new conversation with virtually every American, because people now are beginning to realize in considerable detail just how incompetent he is.
You were there when Jimmy Carter went out and Ronald Reagan came in. In a lot of ways, I know it's not exactly the same, but the mood of the United States, it feels to me politically, is somewhat similar to what we had back then.
Well, I think it's worse. I think people are more cynical. I think they're more fed up with Washington. I think they're more depressed economically. This stuff has been going on a long time. We've been fighting now for 13 years, since 9/11 in 2001. We are in the longest, deepest period of weak economics since the Great Depression. And Washington is so sunk down into a mess of people just yelling at each other that I think people really are deeply disillusioned. So I would say the mood today is probably worse than it was under Carter. And of course, one of the reasons I'm an optimist is I was a freshman, as you pointed out, in Jimmy Carter's last 2 years. I saw this country turn around within a matter of days when Ronald Reagan became president, because he knew what he was doing. He knew how to do it, and he did it brilliantly.
One of the things that you did brilliantly that the Republicans are being criticized, and probably rightly so, is where is the vision? I mean, you came out with a contract with America, and some people look back and say, well, you know, I wish we had had a few more things there or pulled out or whatever, but at least it was a vision. Are the Republicans, is there a vision out there from somebody?
Well, sure. Look, I think you see a lot of things moving in the right general direction. As you were saying to me a while ago, you just had Tom Price on.
Right.
We have a clear vision of getting to a balanced budget. We have a clear vision of dramatically developing America's energy policies, which will create millions of new jobs and will strengthen our national security. We have a clear vision that we believe that replacing Obamacare with a patient-centered and doctor-centered model that gets decisions back home rather than in Washington is the right direction. So there are a lot of places we're moving in the right direction. I wrote Breakout in part to lay out for the Republican Party a very deep fundamental approach. I gave a speech at the American Enterprise Institute, which you can see either by going to the American Enterprise Institute's website or by going to GingrichProductions.com. But I gave a speech in the middle of August outlining what a 21st century visionary veteran service system would be like that could replace the bureaucracy and the corruption and the incompetence of the VA with a brand new model built around the service personnel and their ability with smartphones to be empowered to do so many new things. So, I mean, I think we're right at the edge of huge breakthroughs in positive ideas, and I much prefer where we are to where the left is in terms of the ideas of the next generation.
Oh, yeah.
Well, now that you mentioned the VA, one demographic that where my heart is the military. I'm a mother of a son in the Navy. We have a huge military listening audience, so you can speak to them on this. But I am really concerned about the military budget cuts, the morale in the military, the things that my son emails me. He's out on mission, but just the attitudes of those in the Middle East toward our military out in the waters and the close calls that, we never hear about in the news. And it does seem like the other countries really are laughing at us. They don't take us seriously. They're not afraid of America. And these guys feel it. So where is our military in all this? And why is the Pentagon making some of these decisions they're making?
Well, in that sense, we are very much like the Jimmy Carter era. I mean, if you remember, in the 4 years Carter was president, the president never went to the Pentagon for a single recognition of troops by giving out medals. The first week Reagan was president, he went to the Pentagon. I mean, it electrified through all the American system across the whole planet that we have a president who cares about us. I'm an Army brat. My dad spent 27 years in the infantry, and I know what it means to a military family, so I know what you're saying and what it means to a military family to have a president who cares. And it's so obvious that Obama doesn't care, doesn't understand it, even if he did care, and has no interest in it, that it's painful.
Yeah. You got it.
And I don't think it was any coincidence that the Iranian government let the hostages go the day that Reagan was inaugurated. I mean, I think they realized...
look, I think it's fair to say that the Reagan team had communicated with some intensity to the Iranians that the new president was not likely to be very patient.
Right. The hammer would come down.
And that we were still the most powerful nation in the world, and that we had many options that Jimmy Carter had not noticed.
Right.
And I suspected in that conversation that the Iranians thought, plus they just despised Carter. Yeah. And so I think in part they wanted to deliberately slap him in the face by releasing the hostages as he was leaving office, a sort of a, now that he's gone, here's your hostages kind of statement. But I remember as a congressman sitting on the platform at the Capitol during the inaugural. The day began with a very cloudy, overcast day. As Jimmy Carter stepped down and Reagan stepped up to take the oath, the clouds separated, the sun came out, the sky was blue. It was literally like Cecil B. DeMille or Spielberg had made this movie. As Reagan was giving his inaugural address, the word began to pass from member to member that the Iranian hostages had now left Iranian airspace. Nobody said a word till they were out of Iranian airspace. It was electric. To be a member of Congress up there and realize he hadn't even finished the inaugural address, and one of the greatest psychological burdens we've been carrying is over. And it was just amazing to watch the impact that had.
I don't know if our psychological burden of Jimmy Carter is quite over. He just gave that speech to the Islamic Society.
Well,
what do we have to do to get rid of this guy?
Is not over. I was thinking about the burden of the hostages.
That's right. Well,
Jimmy Carter, bless his heart, never had a clue, and has gone through his entire life clueless. Yeah. But it's nice to know that this is a great country, and that you can have occasional clueless people wander around. And he doesn't do much damage. He might be better off on the Comedy Channel, but still, you got to. He writes pretty good poetry, and he writes occasionally interesting books. And in between, he does what he can to screw up the country, but it's not much anymore.
Mr. Speaker, I love your optimism, and I'm getting electrified just as we're having this conversation.
Hope.
And we've kept you over, but let me just ask you in closing. Tonight there's a big debate between Kay Hagan and Tom Tillis down here in North Carolina. Give me some optimism for this November and the Senate.
Okay, this is such a simple choice. If you think what we need in Washington is somebody who's going to vote with Barack Obama overwhelmingly, who's going to support Barack Obama, who's going to make sure that Barack Obama keeps control of the Senate, you ought to vote for Kay Hagan. I mean, if you think that's a better American future, Kay Hagan is a perfectly reasonable example of a pro-Obama liberal. If, on the other hand, you want somebody who's been in business, who knows how to balance the budget, who understands the value of a dollar in your pocket rather than the government's, and whose instinct is to get power out of Washington and back home to North Carolina, you ought to be for Tom Tillis.
There you go.
It's a very simple race, And I think in the end that Tillis is going to win, because I think the people of North Carolina don't want to see an Obama senator go back to Washington representing their state.
Well, and I think we've had enough of Harry Reid as well. Mr. Speaker, thank you so much.
You.
One last question. Any big announcements? I mean...
Big announcement. My wife, Callista, has a brand new children's book, her fourth, coming out in October. It is called From Sea to Shining Sea, and Ellis the Elephant teaches 4 to 8-year-olds about Lewis and Clark's expedition. So anybody who has children in that age group or has nieces or nephews, Ellis the Elephant is a great way to introduce them to American history. And Callista Gingrich, I'm very proud of her. This is her fourth book in that series. She's had New York Times bestsellers, and Ellis is off and running again. So that's my biggest announcement for the fall.
Oh, okay. No presidential deals. Hey, Mr. Speaker, thank you so much, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Eastern Carolina News and Views, former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, and great guy. I tell you, I get electrified talking to him. What an optimist.
Usually when we interview people, we're all on the same page. Yeah, we're all going to hell in a handbasket, but he actually gave us something to look forward to, and it's good.
He did. We need to take another time out. We'll be right back.